Welcome to History 2010. My name is Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Now, watch this.
I love kids' electricity.
So, welcome to class. It's great to be back here. I hope you guys all had a good weekend. The weather in Nashville this weekend was spectacular. It was wonderful. Needed something. We just got up Saturday morning and just walked 2 miles. We were just like, let's go. So, I don't know. Pretty cool. Anybody in here got good news they want to share before we get going? My good news is you may recall that during the discussion sessions, I said that there had been a series of the evaluations, the university-wide evaluations, and that they weren't coming back to us. Ultimately, they came through the department, I guess, and so it's kind of up to the chairs to share them. But the good news is, shout out to you guys, because apparently only 5% of the university filled these out, but a couple of my students actually did. And whereas last week I was terrified that you guys had given me some useful feedback I could use and that I didn't get it and that you guys were going to take that as me not caring, I'm happy to report that the feedback that I got was positive. So thank you. So much, I'll say this, like basically anything great that's happened with my job at MTSU has all been because of students. Right. So when you share things like that, it not only means a lot to me because I'm putting a lot of work into it, it helps me. So thank you. All right. So without further ado, let's get into this lecture here. Let me share this screen here. All right. Audible still recording. Lovely. Share this screen. And here we go. Welcome to lecture 7. Welcome to History 2010. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. You guys are like, nuh-uh, your name's not Dr. Sawyer, your name's Red Bull now. Look, guys, it's not, my name's just not on a cup. All right, it doesn't change because I'm drinking something different. And if I did, I would mostly be called Red Bull and Bud Light. So, call me Dr. Sawyer, all right? I'm not drinking Bud Light in this class. That was also a joke. So, just to clarify. All right, so here we go. Let's just talk about what's coming up in the class, all right? Got a couple of things coming up this week and next week. This week, of course, the D2L quiz. As usual, it'll open on Wednesday and it will close on Friday at 8 p.m. It's on the readings and the lectures. Again, I've heard from people that got confused and weren't able to take a quiz and asked for me to reopen it. Just want to reiterate, I do not reopen the quizzes if you missed them, but I dropped the lowest 2. And dropping the lowest 2 is a built-in kind of grace thing where if you miss one because you're human, that's built in there, right? So just work on the future ones. Focus on what you can do. If you miss 2, ultimately, as long as you do well on the other ones, you'll be okay. Cool? And if you don't miss any, that just means if you get all hundreds and you get a 90 on one, cool. Well, you dropped a 90, you're doing well. Good. Next week is going to be the Constitution quiz. Now, I'll save this for you guys who are in here. Once I wrap up lecture today, I'm going to stick around and go through the Constitution quiz and kind of like explain everything and then cut a separate video from that so it'll just be available. So if you guys want to stick around to ask questions if you have any, I'll be happy to do that. But I'm going to do it once I wrap this lecture and then I'll cut that into a separate video. Cool? Good deal. I feel like the feedback from the videos was good, and instead of like writing something, me actually posting a video of me explaining it to you guys and you getting to ask questions, I feel like might be the best way to kind of walk people through that. That's my assessment. But let me know if there's ever a better way to communicate things. Let me know. Okay. Constitution quiz though. I'm going to go ahead and say this. Start reading the Constitution. It's on the Constitution and the first 10 amendments. Start reading it as soon as possible. There is the Constitution Center Constitution app, which I recommend. It's a great app and resource for studying this. The quiz will be on the Constitution as it stood in December of 1791 when the first 10 amendments were ratified. Okay, so it won't be on the Constitution today. I'm just throwing this on the lecture to make sure nobody misses that. And I'll explain more in the lecture video that you guys who are watching it that aren't in the room for this, will all see as a separate video. Cool. All right. So, review. You guys may recall that in the last class, we discussed the founders, and this was in the discussion session. We discussed the founders, and we discussed their worldviews. I wanted to create a form to find out what you guys knew about them. Understandably, most students don't have a lot of an understanding of it. right? And people are like, I can't believe that. It's like, I can believe it. Why would they be in a class on history? Like, why would we be learning stuff here if you already knew it, right? It's funny how people are like, expect you to know something when in fact you were in the place where you're going to learn about it already. So we'll teach about it. But one of the things that I really wanted to drive home to you guys was the importance of narrative, the importance of the time and place they lived, and overall understanding them as human beings, not characters in a novel, not icons, not pseudo gods, not, the worst. Like none of those things, right? None of us are actually as human beings any of the things I just said, right? We are people, we are complex. And for better or for worse, we live under a government structure that was established by these folks, right? And say for better or for worse is up to you, right? But ultimately, understanding the time and place that they lived is important to understand these documents and how they work today. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Did you say the Constitution quiz is going to be over just the Bill of Rights?
It'll be over the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But I'll walk through every single, so the actual text of the Constitution and then the first 10 amendments. But I'll go over that if you want to stick around at the end or just watch the video then. And then I can do, if a bunch of people have questions when they watch the video, I'll just do a follow-up video. Cool?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem, Jenna. Thanks for asking. Good deal. All right, anybody have any questions about the material that we talked about in the discussion session and kind of the summary? No? Okay, cool. All right, so I actually put this in here. It's really just a rundown of what I explained in kind of that middle lecture between the two discussion breakout rooms that we did. And I did them different. Actually, on Thursday, I kind of tried one thing and it was, so on Friday, I did it differently. But overall, all of you got kind of a 15-minute mini lecture in that session about the Enlightenment and how it affected the way that the founders saw the world. So I put this in this lecture so you would have an actual slide with this on it. Your notes from this will be from the discussion session, right? From that. So that's where the material is here. Cool. I got a question in the chat here. Does anyone know what the name of the Constitution app Dr. Sawyer mentioned? Yes, and I will I will post a link to it as soon as I post the video, right? So all this stuff will be in the video that I post and links and everything. So yeah, good deal. All right, so just to conclude and wrap up what we talked about last time, here we have the Enlightenment changing the narrative of this generation, right? And not everyone buys into it, but it really does allow you to see the world in a different way. It allows you to challenge earlier forms of authority, like monarchy, right? Which is based on the idea that God tagged somebody, right? And then there you go, that's the king forever. Now the notion was that all men are created equal, which means that everyone has these rights invested in them. And again, the revolutionary statement that governments are constituted by men to secure their liberties, not governments are come from the divine intervention in the world and tag somebody and then they tell you what to do. And if you want to know why property is so important, one more thing I didn't talk about in the discussion session is that in a monarchy, private property is it's a pretty hard thing to balance, because the idea is that the land is on earth and that, it's all essentially given to the king. He'll let you use it, right? But private property it's in pretty hard conflict when you have also at the same time the notion that someone was given everything. Now they coexist, and that's one of the powerful things that happens in England. They manage to coexist, but you certainly see the checks that are put on them by the monarchy, right? The fundamental premise underlying a system that says that God intervenes in everything and that the king has the blessing of God. That means that you can do almost anything with the sanction of the church. Cool? Okay. So there we go. Now, one of the things that I want to cover here really quickly, I tried to cover this in the mini lecture and on Thursday. If you were in my Thursday discussion sessions, I kind of tried to go through this. I realized that I couldn't get into it and kind of give it the nuance it deserved. So I'm going to go over it here. And this has to do with, it kind of comes out of this new world and its relationship to faith. And I think it's important to cover this because one of the things that we see so regularly discussed particularly when we look at the founders, is this question of whether or not the country was founded, the United States was founded as a Christian country. Right? As I said in discussion sessions when I discussed it, excellent historian John Fia at Messiah University has written a fantastic book on this called Was America Founded as a Christian Country? I think that's literally the title, something along those lines. And he opens up and says that's not even a question the founders would have asked. Right? Because people, the way people see the world is different at different times. That's a question you wouldn't have really asked until you have the birth of the evangelical movement that forms in the 1970s, really. Let me get into this. And you've got to get away from history as what you want to have happened, right? So many people go, I would like for this to have happened. So I will go back with an answer that I've already got. I've already got the answer. And now I'm just going to go back and find what information and pick and choose the pieces of information that I can then display to justify the answer I already had. That's not scholarship. It's also not honest. If you want to know the answer to a question like this, you have to go back with an open mind and actually ask questions. And this is why I think, it's such a, like so many things. We've been whipped up and turned against each other on so many of these issues. And at both ends of the fight, you have people with what, from my perspective, is really unnuanced and really not fully honest perspectives. And let me explain this. On the one hand, people say this country was a Christian country, was founded as a Christian nation. Now, let's put that to the test. If we want to say in the statement, this country was explicitly founded as a Christian country, what we would probably find in the founding documents, which here I'm referencing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we would certainly find multiple references specifically to Christianity, specifically to Jesus. Isn't that not fair to say? If we were established, have you ever gone to church and they didn't mention Jesus? Anybody? I've never. Right? They usually do because that's what they're about there, right? So in these documents, which the Declaration of Independence was written fairly quickly and revised, the Constitution itself was laboriously written, and we'll talk about that. Every word in there considered. They don't say that, right? So I think to put the question to the test, I think that's an unfair assessment. And again, as John Fia says, not even really a fair question to ask. Now, the problem with that is that once you reach that point, there's a whole lot of people who go, see, it didn't matter, doesn't matter, the Christianity doesn't matter. It's like, whoa, wait a second. Right? I always say that the argument that I hear most people having is, this country was founded as a Christian nation. Nuh-uh. That's usually what I hear the argument, right? It's not. So here's the thing. People prayed before the Constitutional Convention met. They reference God, right? And notice its specific nature is God, right? Our creator. These are the types of phrases. These are Enlightenment phrases, right? And I told you that, the one thing I was worried about was that people were going to hear my explanation of the difference between kind of the pre-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment view of the world, or pre-Enlightenment and Enlightenment view of the world, and hear me saying, that before the Enlightenment, people just thought God came in and tagged. That's not to say that it precludes the idea that God exists, right? In fact, most of these founders have some notion of God or creator. Many of them are Christians. Many of them have faith in God that's not a Christian, like they call it deism, which is the idea that there is a creator that laid out the rules of the universe and that science is discovering God's rules, right? But in all of this, what you can see is that there is no specific reference. That does not mean that Christianity is not fundamentally important to many of the people that are in that room. And to take a hardline position either way, in my assessment of it, right? You got to say I don't have a horse in the race. Okay, you got to say that what happened didn't just happen for me to prove my point right now. We have to go back and look at it. And when you look at that, it's nuanced. The one thing you can see though in all of this is whatever you take away. Certainly they had different perspectives. The one thing you can see is that they secured the right for you to worship how you want. That is secure. I think for anyone who has faith, I don't understand why they're like, well, I need the founders to have had faith. The world history is full of leaders who did not have the faith that you have, right? If you believe, if you have a notion of God and a belief in God, honestly, it's, you think if you're a Christian, do you believe that Jesus found out Benjamin Franklin wasn't a Christian and was like, oh man, this shakes things up? No, the world's always worked like that. It's okay. I guess, the way that I try to describe it often is when one of the things people will come back at and say, well, they might not say that it's Christian in the documents, but the people who created it, many of them were Christians. Okay, that's true. But to them, they're creating institutions. They're creating state institutions. That doesn't have to be something that directly grows out of their religions. Right? And that's totally possible, right? You guys, whatever your faith is, you guys do things every day that just operate and you have to do, and they're neither like part of or not part of your faith, right? I guess the best way to say it is, if I am a Christian and I change the oil in my truck, did I give my truck a Christian oil job? You see what I'm saying? Is the oil change that I gave fundamentally Christian? That's the point. You don't see it that way. Now, somebody else might show up and be like, no, it is, because now that oil change is what changed the world. But at the end of the day, I think the point is that under all of this, the general principle is to respect people's faith and to not feel like you need to constantly be throwing things in their face. Look at the whole picture. Does that make sense to you guys? It's like so many things where if you truly study it, it puts you smack dab in the middle of everybody, so all the bullets hit you. But it's my job as a professor to deliver this to you and share this information with you. And I think if you look at most things, you will find that the world is not all or none. Cool? All right. So, speaking of all or none, let's go back to this guy. Y'all remember this guy, Benjamin Franklin? Look at his face. Look at his face. All right? Look at him. Look at him. You guys remember him? Oh, you poor people that missed discussion session this week. Don't know why this is so funny, but you shouldn't miss it. Anyway, he had some advice he gave to a friend. You go back and check it out. Anyway, it's weird. Just want to say a few more things about him real quick. Franklin is the old man of the Revolution. He is way older than almost all of the other founders. He's born in 1706, right? Which means he's 70 years old when the Declaration of Independence is signed. So you've got this guy. He is known throughout the world. At the time of the American Revolution, there's really one guy that most Americans know, and it's Benjamin Franklin. It's going to also be George Washington. But remember I told all you guys that there was such the colonies were split, right? The colonies really didn't talk to each other much before the Revolution. And that the decade before the Revolution, you start seeing more communication, you start seeing more collaboration. And ultimately, it's the series, like the Stamp Act is a really big one. But that series of events drives the colonies together and they begin talking more, right? This is how Franklin becomes known. He's in printing. I mean, he's a guy who is writing and a guy who is prominent. He's wealthy. This guy invents like everything because he makes a fortune when he's young off of printing, and he can just sit back and tinker. He's got money, he's got time, and he's got the scientific method. That's this guy's ability to contribute so much. Smart. He also is a diplomat, and this is going to be key. He lives in England for a long time. Like years. He moves from Philadelphia to England, and he's just hanging out. He doesn't think at one point he's ever going to come back to the colonies, but the series of events with the Revolution ends up convincing him to come back, and he stays. But people love him, dude. People love Benjamin Franklin. This guy is going to be sent abroad as a diplomat, and we'll talk about this when we get into it. Like, we're trying to convince the French from like day one to get in here and give us some money and support us in this Revolutionary War. Who do you send? You send the world's favorite American, Benjamin Franklin, who is going to go over to France, look around. He knows how to read people pretty well. Realize that the French think that the American Revolution is this neat thing of these like like these forest people fighting this empire. Oh, isn't it neat? Look at them. They're so rugged, right? They're just these frontiersmen. So Ben Franklin is going to play right into it. He's going to be hanging out in France wearing a raccoon skin hat a lot of the time and playing up his dialect to seem real folksy so that people like him. And they do. So he ends up playing an important role. He dies in 1790. He dies the year after the first government meets. He's really, because of his age, there's not much of an opportunity for him to contribute much to the government once it's established. He's there when they write the Constitution, but he doesn't contribute much after that, reasonably. Lived a long time for those days. Now we'll move on to another guy that I've mentioned some. And I'm setting you guys up with these characters so that you can kind of understand where we're going, because a lot of the story we're going to tell is going to hinge on these figures. Why? Well, because you know who every single one of these people I'm mentioning is, but you almost know nothing about them. So if we follow them through the revolution, it will both give you a way to hang the story on characters, not literally characters, but on figures, but also teach you something about them as well. George Washington. Now, you notice this, George Washington's older than a lot of the other founders. He's born in 1732, right? So he's already over 20 years older than Franklin when all this starts out. I mentioned before that he had served in the Virginia militia from 1753 until 1758. He had always wanted to be an officer in the British Army, right? Because he's in the Virginia militia, but he wants to be recognized in the British Army. He has a huge blunder at the beginning of the French and Indian War. He manages to rebuild his reputation, but it never quite overcomes it. And so in 1758, he steps down from the army. He goes into politics, serves in the Virginia House of Burgesses for almost 20 years in between. 1775. Anybody know why he stepped down in 1775 from the House of Burgesses? Anybody know what happened in 1775? Yeah, he's appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Hard to do both of those at the same time. So he takes that. Excellent. Who said that? Austin. Excellent, Austin. Yeah. No, he steps down and he serves. I mean, this is the thing about him. He's going to serve almost his entire life in public service, right? And a lot of it as an officer and a lot of it as in politics. He'd been outspoken against taxation, but I want to drive this thing home to you guys. I want to drive home again what I'd said before. Say it again. That, you can't do what ifs in history and really prove things, right? So you can't go, if this person hadn't done this, then this, right? You can only go, if this person had done this, then maybe it wouldn't have. But let me just say, that if you got to play those games and you look at the American Revolution, there is, again, one person that if that person is not there, I can't imagine things going the way they do. In my assessment, it's Washington. And a lot of historians' assessment, it's Washington. Here's why. He doesn't have a lust for power. In fact, he seems uncorrupted by it. And to everyone who knows him, in an era where people are terrified that they're just going to fight a revolution and see a new king pop up, having a guy that everyone is really sure he's really sure that he never wants to be a king, that's important. He has no children in his life. He was sterile. Most people think he may have gotten sterile on a trip to the Caribbean he took when he was younger. We're not sure. All we know is that he had no children. Martha, his wife, had children before, but he has no children because he's sterile. And that's important because, monarchs require children to pass their heritage on to. So even in the event that this guy goes sideways on us, we know he can't do a hereditary thing. But more than anything, it's the power. He seems uncorrupted by it. Politically, anyway, right? Political power or military power. Let me just put this in context, because you probably are like, well, I thought he was going to be like an awesome general, probably called in some airstrikes, fought with dragons and stuff like that. I know it's disappointing when you first think about it. You're like, so also he's really good at running away. You'll figure that out. That's a big like he just escapes, and you guys are like, that's the best. Yeah, if the game plan is not to get caught, we'll get into that. But yeah, he's really good at it. But in terms of his temperament, he's not corrupted by power at a time when people are terrified of tyranny. And let me just point this out to you, okay? The story of what power does to human beings, that is a fundamental story that exists across time. It is something that you see if you understand this as a premise. You see it in so many lives and so many stories. Its way into literature and history and scripture. Look. Let's just put it like this. All right. You guys know the story of King Solomon? These Old Testament stories are good because they're shared by several faiths. King Solomon, right? So the son of David, King Solomon comes to power, and what's he do? If you just basic arc of the story, he comes to power. It's contested, but God comes to him in a dream and says, "I'll give you anything you want." And what does King Solomon say? He says, "I want wisdom." Good answer. All right. So I want wisdom, and because of that wisdom, King Solomon brings the kingdom of Israel to the highest point it's ever reached. To the maximum power it's ever seen. But in doing all of that, King Solomon begins to believe his own hype. He begins to believe that he, a man who has spoken to God, he believes that he is above the law of God, and he starts breaking the rules that God set for him. And what happens? He brings the kingdom down. It falls apart. That story is a lesson of how power can make us think that we are above even the most fundamentally important things we care about. It is a story about how power ruins people and their communities. That's why I named my kid Solomon, actually. Because I wanted from his whole life to remember that, like, whatever you have, whatever power you have to think about other people and remember that you're not too big and you're not bigger than other folks. I wanted him always to remember that, because I think that's one of the great things that we forget, is that power is something we should watch in ourselves even. But that story is also in just like literature and movies. Have you guys seen Lord of the Rings? You guys seen who's seen Lord of the Rings? Who's seen Lord of the Rings? Do you know the story of Lord of the Rings? Okay, cool. If you don't, okay. So the story is there's this monster that has this power ring, right? That's not that one. That's a marriage ring. That's the opposite. But it has a power ring, and this power ring is like it's awesome because you can do anything with it. But it starts off and they're like fighting a monster who's got, oh no, this ghoul's got this thing and he's more powerful than ever. And everyone bands together, and the last second they manage to cut this power ring off this person's hand, and they're like, let's throw it in the volcano to destroy it so we never have to have this happen again. And the guy who killed him is like, yeah, let's definitely do that. He picks up the ring and he's like, let's do it, but first maybe we'll do some good things with it. Flash forward. Now he's a monster. You got to destroy it. And then in the end, they have to go find a group of people called hobbits that people forgot even existed, because they were the only ones who anyone thought might be uncorruptible enough to get it to the volcano and throw it in, right? That's the story. And who are the worst about it? It's men, right? It's men in the story, right? The humans in the story that are the ones that are just go nuts over the power. It's in there. Am I calling George Washington the Frodo Baggins of American history? Maybe, but in a nice way. The fact that people knew that this guy, George Washington, they felt they could trust him with power. That is the key. So let's move on now to your other founders. One we haven't talked about much yet, because he's barely going to show up just before this Revolutionary War starts. This little immigrant kid from the islands down the Caribbean, a guy named Alexander Hamilton. And I'm going to start off by showing you guys something here. Let me stop the share screen real quick, just so I can make sure I got the sound on. Show of hands, how many of you guys have seen the Hamilton musical before? Are familiar with it? Okay. It's like about 4 or 5 people. Cool. That's really helpful, by the way. That musical is almost like a cheat sheet to the about 2-3 weeks of this class, because like there's just songs with dates in them. So it's really good. But you guys know this. I mean, this guy Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote a hip hop musical about Alexander Hamilton. When I first heard about this, because it's based off one of my favorite biographies of all time, and I was like, oh God, no, please. Please don't tell me this is something somebody did. Turns out it's pretty good. Jay-Z and Beyonce went and saw it twice, which honestly, if Jay-Z and Beyonce ever even showed up to one of my lectures, I'd never stop talking about it. So what I want to tell you guys is, I mean, this won all these awards. This one came out on Disney Plus this summer. It's amazing, in my opinion, right? Some people hate it. My neighbor hates it, but it's fine. We all like different things, but I think it's amazing. A lot of people do. Now, what I'm going to show you guys is not from that actual musical. I want to show you guys the opening track, the first time that Lin-Manuel Miranda actually performed it live, before he knows that it's going to be good. And I want you to see people laughing at him. And then I want you to see. So this is from 2009. It's from the White House Poetry Slam. And just listen to the words. The words tell the story of Hamilton, and they're right. And this is good and concise. So here we go.
My God. I'm thrilled the White House called me tonight because I'm actually working on a hip-hop album. It's a concept album about the life of someone I think embodies hip-hop, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. You laugh, but it's true. He was born a penniless orphan in St. Croix of illegitimate birth, became George Washington's right-hand man, became Treasury Secretary, caught beef with every other founding father, and all on the strength of his writing. I think he embodies the word's ability to make a difference. So I'm going to be doing the first song from that tonight. I'm accompanied by Tony and Grammy-winning music director Alex Lacamoire. Anything you need to know. I'll be playing Vice President Aaron Burr, and snap along if you like. How does a bastard orphan son of a whore and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by providence, impoverished and squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. By 14, they had placed him in charge of the trade and charter, and every day while slaves were being slaughtered or carted away across the waves, our Hamilton kept his guard up. Inside he was longing for something to be a part of. The brother was ready to beg, steal, borrow, or barter. Then a hurricane came and devastation reigned, and our man saw his future dripping down the drain. Put a pencil to his temple, connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. Well, the word got around, they said this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world is gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton, and there's a million things he hasn't done, but just you wait, just you wait. When he was 10, his father split, full of it, debt-ridden. 2 years later, see Alex and his mother bedridden, half dead, sitting in their room, sick, the scent thick, and Alex got better, but his mother went quick. Moved in with a cousin, the cousin committed suicide, left him with nothing but ruined pride, something new inside, a voice saying, Alex, you gotta fend for yourself. He started retreating and reading every treatise on the shelf. There would have been nothing left to do for someone less astute. He would have been dead and destitute without a cent of restitution. Started working, clerking for his late mother's landlord, trading sugar cane and rum and other things he can't afford, scamming for every book he can get his hands on, planning for the future. See him now as he stands on the bow of a ship headed for a new land. In New York, you can be a new man. The ship is in the harbor now, see if you can spot him. Another immigrant coming up from the bottom. His enemies destroyed his rep, America forgot him. And me, I'm the damn fool that shot him. Alexander Hamilton, we were waiting in the weeds for you. You could never back down, you always had to speak your mind. But Alexander Hamilton, we could never take your deeds from you. In our cowardice and our shame, we will try to destroy your name, but the world will never be I'm the damn genius that shot him. Thank you.
I could have showed you the actual opening part of this like the musical now that it's out. And I've actually like seen bootleg versions, the different versions of it. I always show that one because I want you guys to see somebody with what sounds like a crazy idea walk up in front of people, get laughed at, and then kill a room. All right. That's the kind of thing you guys got to know, that some of the best ideas in the world are laughed at first. So there's a lesson in that. But overall, it really explains Hamilton's origin story really tightly. The kid, first of all, there's still some question as to when he's born. If it's 1755 or 1753, he lied about his age before, and there's some documentation. Most people generally agree it's 1755 at this point. He's orphaned twice. His mother was known to be wild. That she, I mean, I guess I don't know how to say it, right? I mean, she had a lot of lovers. And so Alex grew up with that. His father left. So he's born without really his father around. He'd be considered a bastard, right? Which is at this time really a slight, diminishes your honor, because, as babies, we all decide whether or not our parents are there for us, right? So it's definitely your fault if something like that happened. Anyway, so he then moves in with some family members. They die. So by this point, the kid's like 13, and he's lived with people who were there to take care of him, and they just died right there. He goes to work at a import-export firm in the Caribbean. And I think I mentioned this before. These islands in the Caribbean are some of the most profitable square miles of Earth on the planet. Trade from all over the world coming in and out of these. Hamilton, strangely enough, gets so Hamilton's from nothing. He's got a brother too. His brother gets apprenticed to be a carpenter, which is like the lowest trade you can have in the Caribbean at the time. One of the absolute bottom trade, mostly because it's associated with black immigrants and black folks there. And it's a long history of that. But Hamilton gets apprenticed into one of the most lucrative careers a person could ever want. And from that position, from the time he's a teenager, he is observing world trade. He is observing and keeping books. He's a teenager, and the guy who owns the place will leave him to run the business for a while he's gone. Dude, I once got left at my golf cart. I worked at a driving range. I got left alone with my buddy, and we tried to see if we could drink 6 sun drops in an hour. We did. It wasn't that hour that was the worst one of the day. Soccer practice in August that same day. Anyway, Hamilton's on top of it. And in fact, he writes an account of a hurricane, right? It's a lot of the stuff in the musical is like the details, they change. They're not exactly the way they were. He didn't see the hurricane. The hurricane was on a different island. He wrote the letter anonymously to let people know about the devastation he had read about, to try to get relief there. People saw that letter and said, who wrote this? This is amazing. And turns out it was that teenage kid that worked at the import-export firm. And people around him pull their money to send him to get an education in the American colonies. He goes to New Jersey. He just shows up there a few years before the revolution started, in the middle of all this buildup. And he wants to go to Princeton. All right. He wants to go to Princeton, but they don't let him in. Remember that. Okay. Remember, this is going to be important later. You're going to really appreciate something later if I tell you that. All right. If you remember that. He wants to go to Princeton, but he doesn't get in. So he ends up moving to New York City, to King's College, which is today Columbia University. And he pursues his education there. He finds himself incredibly sympathetic with the patriot cause, enlists as an officer, even though he has almost no experience whatsoever, except for what he's read in the books and the basic drilling he would have gotten, like in the colony he was from, or in the island he was from. His origins in the Caribbean have a couple of long-term consequences for the country, and for him, and for the story. First of all, unlike John Adams, who thinks of himself as a Massachusettser, or whatever you call him, or Thomas Jefferson, who thinks of himself as a Virginian, or anybody who thinks of themselves as being from a colony first, right, and later on a state, Hamilton has He claims New York. He cares about New York, but he doesn't have that kind of ingrained sense of loyalty to a state first. He's free emotionally to embrace a federal government, is what I'm saying. So he doesn't have that reservation. Also, the Caribbean, as a site of world trade at the time, also was the site of the slave trade. One of Hamilton's jobs at the import-export firm was to go onto the ships coming in and to do kind of inventory. And what you would do is you would make sure all the things on the ship register said they were there, and then you would register anything that was broken or missing or damaged, anything like that. As a young person, Hamilton had to go onto ships that had enslaved people who were stolen from Africa on them, who had just endured thousands of miles trip across the ocean. And Hamilton was forced to go into those ships, look at human beings who had suffered through all of that, and when they had died, he was forced to simply mark on a sheet that they were broken inventory. That marked him for the rest of his life. Of the founders, Hamilton is one of the, if not the most clearly anti-slavery that there is. That's from his experience. He himself has no affiliation with the plantation, never owns anyone enslaved in his life. There are others who felt the same way. Marquis de Lafayette, for one. John Laurens, another one. Those folks, John Laurens will be dead by the time this war ends. Lafayette goes back to France. So that leaves Hamilton as one of the most significant anti-slavery individuals in the founding government. Franklin himself was also against it. But yeah, it's not, you may have people that don't own enslaved people, but this early group of people who are actually against it, they're really unique. And there's not going to be a lot of that after this first generation for a while, for a couple of decades. So there we go. This kid is going to be basically reading books on military tactics and getting his classmates from Columbia University to form, to basically form a group. And then he is going to beg for someone to give him a commission. He gets a commission as a major in the New York militia. And they're going to steal some cannon from the British. And when Washington shows up, he's going to be like, I need someone who's educated, can read and write multiple language, can correspond for me. And that's how they're going to get to know each other. I'll tell more about it when we get there. And finally, TJ, Thomas Jefferson. We talked about him in the discussion session some. Born 1743 in Virginia. He had been a member of the House of Burgesses. He knew Washington, certainly younger. He's a great writer. This is what I love about him. Jefferson apparently was, I mean, you know, of course, he's a great writer. But apparently he had a tiny little squeaky speaking voice. And you guys are like, that's funny. No. It is funny. But because he's 6'3", he's the tallest president ever. He's like 6'3", 6'4" by some accounts. He's taller than Washington, which most people don't know. So and he's also best friends with Madison, who's like 5'4" and the smallest president we've ever had. So seeing the two of them kicking it together must have been a real riot. Anyway, just, you know. So the thing about him not being able to speak that loud is that this is an era where there are no microphones. This is not an era where you just go, okay, check. You don't do that. You walk in front of a group of people and as many people can hear you as you are loud. That's why, you know, Patrick Henry, I've talked about him from Virginia. He's important in these early days. He is known as this renowned orator at the time because he has this huge voice. He can go into these churches and halls and speak and it echoes. And until you have microphones, the ability to do that is a real asset if you were in politics or you're trying to lead. But Jefferson apparently had a small voice. And, you know, like some people have said that he would kind of not like people that had big booming voices. He'd kind of be like, man, that guy's sick right there. I don't want that guy. You know, that's the way I imagine. I went to high school with a huge guy who talked like that. There's this dude, he was like 6'2", like 300 pounds. You'd be like, what's up, foo? And he'd be like, what's up, motherfucker? What's up, Cass? And he'd just be like that. He's the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life because he'd be like, what, you know, step up to me? And he'd try to fight people like that. It's still. Oh, don't fight him. I know it's funny, but don't laugh at him. That's my advice if you see him. I think he's still making the rounds. Anyway, but Jefferson had this small voice, right? And I'll conclude by saying this because this is one of the narratives that we have and I think it's one of the interesting things is that when you look at the United States, there is a lot of tension between two general visions of this country. And I think we can boil it down to this original, in a lot of ways, it comes out and can really be captured in this struggle between Washington, it's not Washington, in the struggle between Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson believed that the virtuous life, and virtue matters a lot for these people, right? Because remember, they no longer expect that God's going to pick their leaders. They expect they have to work to be leaders. They have to seek to be virtuous. They have to maximize the potential they have as human beings, and this is work. So the virtuous life matters. And Jefferson believes that the virtuous life, the future of America, lies in the countryside. Small household farmers who have their own land, right? Secured private property, who work for what they have, who can provide for themselves, and that in that, it's called the yeoman farmer, right? The yeoman, the individual holder, not a person that owns a plantation or even owns extra work and hires somebody, the person that produces all for themselves and takes care of themselves. That's Jefferson's ideal American citizen. He sees the future in the country. Hamilton, on the other hand, Hamilton's a finance guy. Hamilton believes the future of the country will only be secured if the country can lay in place a strong financial system to give it the leverage it needs in the world to be able to develop the economy, to develop manufacturing. We're decades behind England at this point, and Hamilton believes that by setting up the correct financial system, we can catch up. He believes the future of this country is not in the countryside, it's in the city. The key player there is the banking system. I think we like to think that we live in the world of Jefferson. It makes us feel good, right? I'll take care of ourselves. We don't need anybody. Jefferson was worried the banks would make people dependent on other people. We like to think, I'll take care of myself, right? That's what that's what I like to think, right? I like to think that I can handle things my own. But I think all of us, no matter how much we like that idea, have to acknowledge that we probably live in Hamilton's world more than that. Everyone here, I love my neighbor across the street, Gerard. Gerard buys cars with cash. That's awesome. He's the only person I know that buys cars with cash. Houses. My grandma bought a house with cash. That's because she was married 5 times and, just kept on getting, she married 5 times anyway. More on that. She lived through the Depression and she saved everything, and she had a whole lot of people that kind of died and left her a pension. She bought houses with cash. Okay, cool. But most of us are going to get loans, right? A lot of you got loans to go to college, right? A lot of you can get loans if you go to the house, right? A lot of you guys know that our country is like, trillions of dollars in debt, right? We live in a financial world. We're all dependent on each other. The contrast is important. I will say this is the last little tidbit here. A lot of controversy over Jefferson and slavery. He gets a lot of it, even though other ones were slave owners as well. I mentioned before in the discussion session that a lot of that is because of the fact that he spent his life as this Enlightenment thinker, but at the end of his life, he lived so far beyond his means that the enslaved people on his plantation had to be auctioned off to pay his debts. And at the time he dies, that's when the cotton plantations have started in the Deep South, and that is a whole different world, sending people into one of the worst living conditions anyone could ever imagine. But there's also an interesting factor, because you guys know that he fathered children with one of the enslaved women that came to his household, Sally Hemings. This was covered up by the white descendants for a long time, though, and just flatly denied until, you guys know, though, you guys see it pretty frequently, right? Somebody's like, that ain't my baby. And then suddenly they go on like Maury and they're like, oh, we got DNA tests now, dude. Sorry. Kind of happened with the Jefferson family. In the end, though, yeah, he had children with an enslaved woman. Leave you with this fact. Hemings had come to live on Jefferson's plantation after Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law passed away and left him enslaved people for his plantation. Hemings was the child, almost certainly. So she was mixed. She was the child of a white father and a black mother. And the evidence tends to point to the fact that the father of Sally Hemings was Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law, which meant that Sally Hemings was his dead wife's half-sister. What I'm saying is, man, some people got to type, some people got to type. There we go. All right. So there we go. Next time we'll start off on the Revolutionary War. We'll get these guys in action. I hope that gave you some overview. We will develop and tell more about them as we go along.